that we are going to record this webinar. Well, thank you for being here. It really is a true honor to be able to welcome Dr. David Pellow to Whitman. I think this is one of those small bright spots of a pandemic situation, being able to have brilliant scholars come to Whitman with much more ease than they normally can. I have been reading Dr. Pellow's work since my first year as a graduate student, and all of my students have read his work in classes, so I'm sure that people are going to have a lot of questions and really enjoy learning from him today. He is the Delson Chair and Professor of the Environmental Studies program at University of California, Santa Barbara, and the Director of the Global Environmental Justice Project. He is a leading scholar in environmental sociology and interdisciplinary studies of environmental justice, human-animal conflicts, and social inequality. He received his PhD from Northwestern University and was also a sociology undergrad, which is always fun to see the continuity there. He's the author of at least 10 books that I have been able to track down, and dozens of articles. The winner of the Outstanding Publication Award, the Outreach and Practice Award, and the Technology and Humanism Award from the American Sociological Association's Environmental Sociology section. And with his work with the Global Environmental Justice Project at UC Santa Barbara, he links research with action, with outreach and teaching efforts in a really inspiring way, and has been working on this topic that he'll share with us today about incarceration and racial and environmental justice for 4 or 5 years, or perhaps even longer than that, from what I can tell from the website. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Pellow with us, and we will have some time at the end for questions. I will hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Cordner, for that generous introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you here today. I hope everybody is staying healthy and well. I want to first start with my screen share and see if I can get that correct. Can you hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Okay, so it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to begin with a land acknowledgement from what we now call Santa Barbara, but is of course occupied and unceded indigenous ancestral land and territories and waters of the Chumash people. And I want to also say thank you to the Chumash people, the youth, community advocates, and indigenous leaders and elders who have given me and other faculty at UC Santa Barbara the opportunity to build or perhaps rebuild relationships of trust and respect, reciprocity, and consent. So I would like to then, of course, again, say thank you so much to Professor Cordner for arranging this. And thanks to all of you for showing up today. So I want to talk about America's prisons and the movements for racial and environmental justice. And the reason why I'm interested in this as an environmental sociologist is because prisons or carceral spaces more generally are places where we're seeing struggles for environmental justice, pushback against environmental racism and other forms of social and ecological violence. And these are sites where we find water contamination is quite prevalent, the contamination of air, the contamination of food. Of course, the food in prisons, isn't anything to write home about to begin with. So that's sort of a layered problem there. And we have just an enormous amount of toxins in these facilities, and the facilities themselves are often in harm's way, in flood zones, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So, so this is, for me, a really fascinating site for studying some of the key questions that environmental sociologists are interested in. And so just by way of an outline, some signposting here, I want to talk about settler colonialism, a hot topic these days, and link that to environmental justice, and get into this concept of critical environmental justice that a number of colleagues, myself included, have been pushing and promoting, and then apply that to the case of the US prison system, and then draw some conclusions. So there are 3 questions that really guide and structure all of my work in general, and certainly are applicable to this talk and this particular case study that I'm going to be focusing on today. And the first is, how are social inequality and environmental quality linked, right? And to me, that's kind of the foundational fundamental question that folks in the field or subfield of environmental justice studies are focused on. And of course, we're now seeing that in the growing movement and growing field for climate justice studies as well. The second question is, what roles are grassroots social change makers taking on in terms of shaping environmental policy? So this isn't just sort of a woe is me and a doomsday story. There's all these freaking problems out there, and we're not going to do anything about it. No, I'm very much focused on what people can and have and perhaps should be doing to address some of these formidable problems. And related to that, of course, is this third question, and that is, how can we improve the quality of life for human beings, improve our well-being and our life chances while simultaneously promoting ecological sustainability? And these three questions are really, I think, at the heart of the movement and the scholarship for environmental justice. And I'm sure we're not unique, but it is one of those perhaps somewhat unique fields, interdisciplinary field, where the politics, that is the influence of the movement, and the scholarship often are aligned, sometimes are in conflict, but definitely overlap. Okay, so let's continue. And sorry for all the verbiage here, but I wanted to give props to Potawatomi scholar and philosopher Kyle Powys White, who's got this really long definition of settler colonialism. And he says it refers to the complex social processes in which at least one society or one nation really seeks to impose itself, to move permanently onto the land, onto the aquatic spaces, even the aerial spaces that are occupied by another community. And what is fascinating about this is that it's really a way, sort of an ecological or a multi-species way of understanding age-old forms of colonialism, right? And so understanding that this is a multi-species process, this isn't just about land, this is also about territory, about water, and about aerial spaces as well. So it's a very comprehensive definition, but I try to boil it down in the second bullet point and say that settler colonialism is essentially the control or the occupation over land, water, aerial space, and of course people by an external power or a previously external power. Kyle Powys White goes a step further, and this really speaks volumes for me and is very, very front and center for this talk. And he says that settler colonialism is a form of environmental injustice because, at least in the case of the United States, that process really aims directly at making it quite difficult for indigenous peoples to just live, right? To have their cultures flourish, to practice their economic practices, to engage in political self-determination. So it not only undermines people, it undermines land, it undermines ecosystems, all of the above. And so it is, in fact, a form of environmental injustice, which means then that some of the lore in the environmental justice literature that says, oh, this movement goes back and started in, 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, we might need to rethink that. And Kyle Powys White might say, well, at least in this hemisphere, certainly in what we now call the United States, we could argue, if you agree with this definition, that the environmental justice issue and the movement for environmental justice probably began centuries before that with the first settler colonies in what became the United States. Some of my colleagues, Tracy Voiles and Elizabeth Hoover, have made the argument that settler colonialism is a framework that really is relevant to any and all environmental justice struggles in the United States, whether or not we can sort of draw a direct line to indigenous peoples, because of course environmental justice conflicts pretty much always involve land and ecological resources that are more broadly just entangled with histories and the afterlives of conquest. So this is something that is always present. Settler colonialism then is something that I'm using to then make a series of arguments. The first of which is that it's a core foundation of US imprisonment, the US carceral system, because it's something that involves human enslavement, right? The caging of human beings. And this goes back at least as far as the 19th century, when the US federal government, the Army, was actually going out and pursuing extermination campaigns against what were called hostiles, native folks whose only crime was essentially protecting and defending their territories, their communities, against the imperial expansion of what we call the United States. Some of those folks who were lucky to be left alive were actually thrown into concentration camps. And I'll talk a little bit about that a bit later. But the point is that human caging in these concentration camps was an early form of imprisonment and was, of course, directly tied to this whole project of settler colonialism, the expansion of US empire. And so I want to then make another argument, which is that human enslavement itself in the form of prison systems is an example of environmental injustice. And I argue that because prisons and carceral spaces are systems that really mete out brutality. They impose violence against human psyches, against human bodies, against human identities, against human communities and the populations even outside the prison, right? Your family members, your friends, your community members who may not be incarcerated are suffering as a result of your incarceration. But it goes further than that. Carceral spaces themselves, prisons and jails themselves, are often built in critical and vulnerable ecosystems and habitats, and they require the destruction and the imposition of harm on non-human populations through their daily functioning and daily maintenance. Just a couple of months ago, in the end of 2020, my colleagues Patrick Greiner and Julius McGee and Carl Appleton wrote an article in the journal Social Currents that demonstrated quantitatively, empirically, that prisons and jails in the United States actually also contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. So human caging, enslavement via the prison system is an example of environmental injustice in that it harms both humans and non-humans continuously. Third, I want to make the argument that environmental injustice then, and I think I've already pretty much said this, is a part of this nation's core, right? Going back to the argument that Kyle Powys White made, that settler colonialism itself is an environmental injustice. Well, the United States is a settler colony. So from the very beginning of this country's history, we have seen the perpetration and the experience of environmental injustice, and therefore people pushing back against that as well. And so the implication of this, for me, at least in my work, is that this matters in large part, well, for a whole host of reasons, but one of which is that environmental injustices are not likely to be addressed terribly effectively if we limit that work entirely and exclusively to existing policy frameworks. We can work within those existing policy frameworks, but I think we also need to exceed those frameworks and exceed the powers of the state. And many folks are talking about this using the language of decolonization and abolition. And so I'm happy to talk further about that later on. The Dakota Access Pipeline is a very concrete example that I think we probably have all heard about, a very concrete example of the current day contemporary ways in which settler colonialism really rears its head in the lives of humans and non-humans, and in particular, indigenous peoples and their territories and their lands and their sacred sites. So this is, of course, the 1,100-mile pipeline. It's going through various parts of the country, but most definitely through the Standing Rock Sioux community, threatening sacred sites and their really precious water sources. So for me, this is a conflict that reveals that the fossil fuel industry itself reflects a settler colonial mentality. And that's not just a discursive reality, that is an infrastructural material reality that indigenous folks are facing in this country. So the field of sociology is kind of the larger arena in which I operate, but more specifically, I focus on, in my work is on environmental justice studies, which is a multidisciplinary field that expands a whole host of other disciplines. And going back at least to the early 1970s, this field really was burgeoning and emerging, and out of empirical evidence and analysis that poor folks, and then later on we found that people of color and other marginalized populations are facing greater environmental threats in the United States. And then we found out this is happening globally, and then it's also food injustices, and it's also climate injustices. And so this thesis is supported by hundreds, thousands of studies that indigenous folks, low-income folks, communities of color face disproportionate environmental threats and health risks as a result. But again, we're interested as well in the grassroots responses to that, what we call the environmental justice movement, the climate justice movement, the food justice movement. This is on full display today. Really, we are seeing the successful flexing of the muscles of this movement in much of the agenda of the Biden-Harris administration. It's quite astonishing to see, particularly the whiplash that we're experiencing from the last administration to this one, where anything that smacked of environmental justice was forbidden. Now it appears to be what is driving much of the environmental policy agenda. So one of the things, of course, we do as scholars is ask the question, how far have we come? What do we know? Where are the gaps? Where are the holes? Where are the limitations in the work that we've done? And so I and a number of other scholars have said, you know what, let's do that. And we're going to play around with some of the language and just call it critical environmental justice. And there are 4 elements of that I want to quickly go through. The first is that it's great that we've got all this data and analysis on income and race, but aren't there other social categories of difference, other ways in which human beings may be suffering the brunt of environmental injustices? So let's expand the number of social categories, the reach of our analyses of environmental injustices to include gender, sexuality, and even disability and nationality, citizenship, and go across the species boundary to look at how non-humans are being affected by this. The second pillar is this point that we're drawing from other social scientists, particularly geographers, who are saying it's great that we're looking at maybe the national scale or the local scale, this case study in a community fighting environmental injustices. I've done that 100 times, but maybe we will have more robust and comprehensive analyses if we're looking at multiple scales simultaneously, both spatially or geographically, but also temporally. And so that's one of the things that we are urging scholars to do as we're doing this work. Another thing is to really say that, this emphasis on state-centric analyses and solutions can be helpful. I think that governments, states, at all levels absolutely can be helpful for resolving and managing environmental crises and environmental injustices. But I've seen a trend in the literature and even in the politics that suggest quite strongly that that's the primary, if not only, game in town. I think we need to broaden our thinking about the possibilities of achieving change and achieving environmental justice in ways that exceed, as I said earlier, exceed state structures, particularly when we look at the track record of governments, and in particular the US EPA as an agency, from Democratic through Republican administrations, and how little that agency has actually done. Again, I mentioned the Joe Biden and Kamala Harris administration, where there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of executive orders. We'll see how far they go with that. But even there, with the euphoria in the air amongst scholars and activists, I caution that, the political winds are going to blow in a different direction fairly soon. So relying on the state as sort of the exclusive arbiter and site of resolution of our environmental justice conflicts has its limits. Finally, I argue that one of the things that is driving environmental injustice is this logic of expendability. The logic that there are certain people and certain species and places that just don't matter, or they matter less, right? And of course, we flip that around, and that's why we have this thing called the Black Lives Matter movement, or the movement for Black lives, precisely because we know, at least those of us who are being honest and transparent, that there are populations in our communities that simply are devalued, right? And this figures prominently into understanding environmental racism and environmental injustice of all sorts. And so this fourth pillar really pushes back against that with a moral, a normative, and ethically centered framework that says we need everyone to solve this problem. And so every one of us is indispensable to creating a socially resilient and ecologically sustainable and just future. So this thing that I'm working on is called the Prison Environmental Justice Project, and Professor Cordner got it right. I've been working on this for about 5 years. It's ongoing, and studying this relationship between carceral spaces and environmental justice concerns. I'm drawing on a number of methods, content analysis of various documents, doing historical and archival work interviews with people who are formerly incarcerated, some who are currently incarcerated, their family members, their allies, and participant observation among folks who are part of this movement for environmental justice in carceral spaces. And of course, I'm taking an activist scholar or scholar activist orientation. I'd like this project to hopefully translate into some small amount of social change, some positive change. So the phase one is the arena, the terrain that I'm currently involved in, which is focusing primarily on the US. I'm starting to move more globally, and would be happy to talk about some of that as well. Back to the point about activist scholarship, one of the groups out there that is that is not a scholarly group, but is an activist group, is the Prison Ecology Project, and an offshoot of them is called the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And so I've been working on and off over the years with these wonderful organizations, and they are trying to do exactly what you could imagine they're trying to do. They are trying to shine the spotlight on the problem of environmental injustices and public health threats in the carceral system in the United States and beyond, with the aim of improving life and the quality of well-being for people in those spaces, and building a movement to do that and to reach policymakers and to reach prisoner advocates inside the prisons, and to work with folks who themselves are what I would say are imprisoned environmental injustice activists. So, so people who are behind bars who are also leading this movement. So that's really some exciting work. Another area of the scholarship that I've been working with and grappling with is what some have called critical prison studies. And it's essentially, I guess, an offshoot, a close relative of criminology, criminal justice. But the view there is that prisons and carceral spaces are fundamentally about racial and gender and sexual and class and colonial oppression, right? And that these are core elements of US and other settler colonial societies. And that unlike, I think, a lot of the scholarship and frankly, a lot of the activism out there that's interested in reforming and tweaking and improving the prison systems, ultimately, and I'm interested in those things, but ultimately, these are folks who believe in abolition, right? Literally dismantling the prison and the carceral system as a preferred solution. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. Okay, so we talked about critical prison studies. Critical environmental justice studies, though, is the overarching framework that I want to play with today. Let me impose that upon or apply that to the prison system. So going back to that first pillar, expanding multiple categories of difference. Let's talk about what that looks like in our carceral spaces in the United States. So we got race and class. This is one of my favorite placards. The whole damn system is racist as hell. I don't know why this guy's wearing a ski mask, but it adds to the dramatic flair. You know, unless you've been living on another planet or under a rock and you don't have internet access, let me inform you that the prison system in the United States is overwhelmingly made up of inmates who are non-white and who are poor, low wealth, low income. That's just a fact. So that's race and class. Let's talk about gender. In the United States, we are number one. Woohoo! No country incarcerates more women than us, and we are proud of it. Women are the fastest growing population in carceral spaces in the United States. And if you compare that to other places on the globe, now Vietnam and Thailand have got us beat in terms of percentages, but we're fighting back and we have got them beat by a long shot on the absolute numbers. And I will return to the question of gender in a minute. So we've talked about race, class, gender. Let's talk about immigration status in the great state of Washington. Near the Seattle-Tacoma area, we have the Northwest Detention Center, a private facility that's run by the GEO Group, one of the largest, if not the largest, private prison companies, a 1,500-bed detention center, immigrant prison, and is built adjacent to a federally designated toxic Superfund site. So this is an example of where we see the intersection of a particular social category of difference, nationality, immigration status, and presumably everyone in here is undocumented or unauthorized, or at least having their citizenship questioned. And then, of course, the prison itself is in a toxic zone, or certainly a terrain, a physical environment that few people with the option of living elsewhere would choose to live there. So that's immigration status. Let's talk about disability. This extraordinary report that Human Rights Watch put out in 2015 demonstrated that in many carceral spaces in the United States, people with disabilities are being targeted for pain compliance through various mechanisms, one of which is OC spray or pepper spray that is being used on many folks with disabilities, because oftentimes folks with disabilities or cognitive impairment may not respond to commands or demands by corrections officers in the ways that many of the rest of us might. And so if they're slow to respond or are unresponsive, in many cases, it has been documented that they have been set upon by corrections officers with pepper spray. And I call this a form of chemical warfare, given how widespread it is being used against folks. Okay, so let's see, we talked about race, class, gender, immigration status, disability. Ooh, let's talk about youth and age. This is a photo of the Oregon Youth Authority's main office. They are the government agency in the state of Oregon that oversees, that supervises and manages the state's juvenile prisons, the juvenile detention center system. Shortly after the crisis in Flint, Michigan, around lead poisoning broke out, folks in the government of the state of Oregon asked the same question. Oh my goodness, could our youth and our schools be facing, and could our population be facing lead poisoning in our various water delivery systems? And so they did testing all over. Someone had the bright idea to do the testing in the Oregon Youth Authority facilities, of which there are 11. And it turns out that fully nine out of the 11 facilities in the state of Oregon have lead and copper levels in their drinking water that is actionable, that is off the charts. That means that it is in violation of various environmental and health regulations. So in these facilities, youth is anywhere between age 12 and 25. And so again, if caging human beings, if imprisoning human beings is already a form of environmental injustice, as I've argued, then there's a layered on top of that, the injustice of being in a space that you can't get out of. And the only water you're able to drink, unless you're being provided with bottled water, is potentially toxic. All right, so that's youth and age. Let's jump the species boundary and talk about humans and non-humans. This is from an incredible case study of Letcher County, Kentucky. This prison proposal would have been for the most expensive penitentiary, federal penitentiary in US history, something like just north of $500 million in the great state of Kentucky. That's why I've got that photo with a pile of money. Lower left corner, we see what is the aftermath and the continuing actually of mountaintop removal. This is a form of mining that involves simply blowing up mountains, dynamiting mountains to get to coal seams, right? And a very efficient, but very horrifically destructive practice of getting at coal and extracting it. And also, by the way, for those of us who may be sort of wondering, oh, can we bring coal jobs back? Well, you don't create many jobs by blowing up mountains. You just don't need many humans to do that. Why am I talking about mountaintop removal? Because this prison, this federal prison, was going to be located on what used to be a mountain full of coal, but they blew the damn thing up, and now there's nothing there, and we can put a prison. So there's layered ecological violence on top of ecological violence. It is also in fairly close spatial proximity to nearby low-income and communities of color, hence another environmental justice concern. And then that brings us to the lower right-hand corner, the Indiana bat and a close cousin, the gray bat, both of whom are suffering from white nose syndrome that is wiping these populations out, making them endangered. And our biologists are still trying to wrap their heads around this. Why do I mention this? Because this area is one of their primary habitats. So a movement of people in Kentucky and around the country mobilized for years, including nearly 24 incarcerated persons, mobilized for years to promote environmental justice in this case and to try to stop this prison from being built. And in June of 2019, the Federal Bureau of Prisons withdrew the proposal and said, it's dead in the water. We're not going to build this prison. We're not going to lay brick number one. This was a massive victory for environmental justice, and legally it was able to happen because the activists were able to make the argument that the environmental impact statements or the environmental impact reports didn't fully account for all of the range of impacts, including on the Indiana and the gray bat. So that is an exciting example of how people have been making these connecting these dots around environmental justice and prisons. So that's the first pillar. Let's talk about the second pillar, multi-scalar analyses, and go to the micro scale. One of the most fascinating things that I've seen in environmental justice and feminist scholarship over the years is people arguing that we need to rethink what we mean by environment. And that's really been what the environmental justice movement and scholarship has done. One of the incredible things there, or exciting things for me, is that we're saying, well, if we're talking about beluga whales and dolphins and polar bears, their bodies are at risk and are at threat and are somehow inherently an environmental issue. Why isn't that the case when we're talking about human bodies, right? And so many scholars have said we need to redefine and rethink of our bodies as part of the environment, as lands, as ecosystems, or at least core parts of ecosystems that must be protected and defended and thought of as a legitimate part of the terrain of environmental justice struggles. So this photo comes from a wonderful group called Black and Pink, which is an advocacy organization that promotes justice for imprisoned, incarcerated folks who are LGBTQ plus and who are HIV positive. Check them out, Black and Pink. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because women and LGBTQ folks are at greater risk of bodily harm than other folks in prisons. These folks, study after study demonstrates that they tend to be targeted for violence because of their gender, because of their gender identity, because of their sexuality. And I would argue that's an example of environmental injustice. Let's jump to the macro scale and go to the great state of Pennsylvania, where State Correctional Institution Fayette is smack dab right next to a coal ash refuse site with some 40,000 tons of coal ash waste that comes from one place, coal-fired power plants, which of course is a leading, if not the #1 contributor to global climate change. So on the left, we've got the prison. In the middle, we've got the coal ash dump. And on the upper right, we've got the town of LaBelle, Pennsylvania. Well, in a study that was done recently, it turns out that prisoners in this facility and residents in LaBelle are suffering from the same symptoms, the same illnesses that if you check out the medical literature, you'll realize is strongly correlated with exposure to coal ash. And so for me, this is a fascinating, if not horrifying, example of sort of multi-scalar analysis, because of course, we've got people's bodies that are being affected by this, and it's part of the global climate change problem. I interviewed a former prisoner who served time there, Richard Mosley, for several years. He spent there, and he told me the following, quote, "I arrived at SCI Fayette in 2009, and I was in great health. I was an athlete and a non-smoker, but within a week of arriving there, my nose started bleeding. I had breathing problems, and I got really sick and had other respiratory disorders. I had no idea about coal ash, but I got so sick that I wrote a letter that I kept on my person that I would ask officials to mail to my family in case I died. My health actually improved after I left the prison. I'm almost totally back to my normal original health," end quote. So again, we've got the micro of the body to the macro of the global climate change question. Here in the state of California, we are seeing this as well. 33+%, at least a third of our of our firefighting workforce is enslaved, or juridically enslaved. They are prisoners. They are folks who are in the prison system. And it's a complicated issue because if you talk to many of these folks, they say, this is a good opportunity for me to get job training so that when I get out of prison, I've got a skill, a marketable skill. And yet they are placed in harm's way as the state of California continues to see year-round wildfire season. And as a result of extreme weather events that are largely driven by climate change. So I mentioned in terms of the multi-scalar analyses, the importance of not just spatial or geographic analyses, but temporal analyses. And I often like to go back to the 13th Amendment, which of course is an amendment to the Constitution, and also a great documentary film by the amazing filmmaker Ava DuVernay, which, as we all know, of course, lays out in black and white that as wonderful as the Emancipation Proclamation was in the 1860s, we have a system of legal enslavement still in the United States. through the prison system. And shortly after that, of course, we saw this phenomenon of convict leasing, where governments would imprison folks, many of whom were African American, and then could lease them out to corporations who, based on a great deal of historical evidence, it turns out, was far more brutal than good old-fashioned chattel slavery, because corporations had zero incentive to keep these people alive and often work them to death. This is a photo of African-American prisoners, enslaved folks doing convict leasing work for the Tennessee Iron and Coal Company, late 19th century, early 20th century. They're engaging in enslaved labor that is unwittingly perpetrating and contributing to anthropogenic climate change. Another really heart-wrenching example of historical examples of environmental justice struggles comes to us from the internment, the concentration camps that were set up for Japanese Americans, the tens of thousands of citizens of Japanese descent who during World War II were locked in concentration camps throughout various parts of the Western United States. Why do I bring this up as an example of environmental justice struggle? Well, because in many cases in these camps, the military actually brought in water pipes that had been repurposed from their previous purpose, where they had been delivering oil, fossil fuels for use in machinery, in heating on army bases. They had been dismantled and repurposed in these concentration camps to deliver water. So they were laced with hydrocarbons that placed these folks at great risk. And so there were a number of health problems that many historians, medical historians, are looking at that we believe resulted from that. So that's pillars 1 and 2. I think I'm going to quickly sum up pillars 3 and 4, again, questioning a reliance on the state to solve our problems, pillar 3. And pillar 4, of course, is rejecting that logic of expendability and embracing indispensability and saying, you know what, to change everything, we need everyone, right? As the great Canadian journalist Naomi Klein and many other climate justice activists have said, much of this is embodied and reflected in the resistance movements that I'd like to talk about now. And so not just in prison environmental justice movements, but really in any prisoner movements for prisoners' rights and human rights, we see a whole spectrum of resistance, which is quite extraordinary, given, of course, the repression and oppression that occurs in prisons whenever you lift a finger, oftentimes to ask for, let alone demand, positive change. And so here I've got just a whole gamut of forms of resistance that we see in prisons, from hunger strikes and labor strikes, commissary boycotts, lawsuits, of course. In the state of California, where we continue to see drought, people are having to fight for access to water, for access to showers. The previous governor, was sued when it was discovered that there was a policy that prisoners couldn't take more than 1 shower per week in some cases. Demanding healthy food. Again, I insist this is an environmental justice issue, because access to food means access to agricultural products that are, of course, produced by engagements with the land and engagements with our ecosystems. And we need food, of course, to remain healthy and to exist. Demanding healthcare. Healthcare in prisons is horrendous. I defy you to find a prison in the United States where healthcare is a model, right? And of course, that reflects the problem of healthcare in general in the United States. For me, as an educator, as a scholar, I have to say this last bullet point is perhaps the most interesting and inspiring. Prisoners, imprisoned folks around the country and around the world, but particularly in the United States, demanding educational programs, and in particular, ethnic studies, women's studies, and sociology. And so that sort of warms my heart. And I know a lot of students and faculty in various institutions around the country have been involved in working to deliver educational programs to people who are incarcerated. And I salute folks who are doing that. So continuing with this theme of resistance, we can go back to the 1980s, the 1990s, when we had groups like MELA, Mothers of East Los Angeles, and Critical Resistance, who were connecting these dots between prisons and environmental justice issues and concerns. These were groups that fought against oil pipelines in South Los Angeles, incinerators in South Los Angeles, jails and prisons in Los Angeles, and Kern Valley, for example, connecting those dots, saying that these prisons were part of a larger assault, an environmental injustice assault against both the landscape and human communities. And I think it's safe to say that this movement is becoming increasingly international, transnational, and global. I mentioned earlier the Flint, Michigan lead poisoning crisis. Flint is based in the county of Genesee, Michigan, and this for me is a really powerful photo. It's brought to you by the Detroit Light Brigade. Really wonderful example of activism that we're seeing all around the world where, you know what, if I am prohibited from setting foot on a bit of property and it's difficult for me to get my message out, then maybe I'll step back and go across the street and project an image and get the message out even more broadly. And so water is a human right, of course, legally in terms of international law, that's a fact. In practice, of course, in the United States and frankly, many, many nations, it's not something that we actually see being implemented, certainly not in the prison system or the jail system. So this county jail, like the rest of Flint, Michigan, was also beset with the problem of lead poisoning in the water. And we had a situation where prison guards or the jail corrections officers did what I'm doing right now and took a sip of filtered water. That's refreshing. And looked on at the inmates and said, you got two choices. You can drink lead-laced water or you can drink no water at all. And this included some inmates who were actually pregnant women at the time. So the environmental justice movement in the prison space is really important for me as well, because long before we were talking about environmental justice, we had these things called political prisoners. Now, many people don't associate the United States with political prisoners, but we should. Two of the world's most famous political prisoners are Leonard Peltier here on the left from the American Indian movement, and of course, Mumia Abu-Jamal on the right, who's been involved for many decades with many Black liberation movements. Now, both of these guys have spoken out via essays that they've written and even speeches that they've recorded from prison about environmental justice outside of prisons and in prisons. So Leonard Peltier has written broadly about how many indigenous folks like himself have been imprisoned precisely because they were fighting against colonialism. Colonialism, which, as I've noted earlier, is a form of environmental injustice. Mumia Abu-Jamal, going back at least as far as the 1980s, and both of these guys, of course, are serving life sentences. And I should also, to be really clear, they are both accused of killing law enforcement officers. And I do want to put that out there. A lot of left-leaning activists sort of omit that, but people's lives were taken in these struggles that these guys were involved in. And it would be really nice if the federal government was actually interested in tracking down the perpetrators of those crimes. There is almost zero evidence that either of these guys were involved in those acts. Going back to Mumia Abu-Jamal, though, going back as far as the 1980s, he was writing essays that were laying out in chapter and verse the problem of water contamination in prisons, like the Frackville prison in the state of Pennsylvania. And he made the very, very important point that in many cases, the same utility districts, the same governmental agencies that are delivering water to jails and prisons, the same agencies that are delivering water to the rest of us. So his point was, if you don't care about people who are incarcerated and you don't care about the contaminated water that many of them are drinking, you should still care about that problem, because in many cases, you're drinking that same water. So as a scholar of environmental justice, I have to ask and answer the question, why? Why am I focusing on environmental justice and prisons? Well, one of the reasons, and there's several, is that prisons and carceral spaces really offer me the opportunity to push beyond the typical sort of reformist solutions that we find in much of the academy and frankly, much of the movement. In so many of the conversations I've had with imprisoned or formerly imprisoned folks, we're having this conversation about abolition, about literally dismantling or at least making irrelevant the prison system in the United States and the jail system around the world. I've often said that one of the most enduring and important victories that the environmental justice movement, and frankly, the environmental justice scholarship has achieved, is redefining the environment, redefining what we even mean when we say, quote unquote, the environment. It's not just those spaces out there. I mean, I'm looking at the Pacific Ocean here. It's beautiful. I've got mountains over there on my right. That's wonderful. Of course, that's part of the environment. But the environment is also those places where humans are, where we live, where we work, play, learn, and pray. And since we do all of those things and more in carceral spaces, maybe we could add and do time to our definition of the environment. There's this other thing called the minority move-in hypothesis. It's been around forever in environmental justice studies circles. And it essentially goes like this. When we find environmental racism, that is the statistical correlation between being a person of color and living in a community that is overly polluted, that is at great risk of environmental harm, we can sleep better at night if we think that the sequence that led to that outcome went like this. First, there was pollution, and then people of color moved in because it's cheaper, the rents are lower, the cost of living is lower. Wouldn't that be nice? That does happen. A scant minority of the time. The vast majority of the time, it's actually the opposite. Polluting industry and various other developments are actually moving into neighborhoods that are already populated by poor folks and communities of color, right? So they are actually being targeted by these polluters. And so that means that the minority move-in hypothesis is but a myth and a dream. Thinking about that in the carceral space where you have almost no say in where you're going to be living and residing in a carceral space, which could also be toxic, means that the minority move-in hypothesis is even further moved. As I've mentioned, one of the most inspiring things is that imprisoned folks themselves, whether it's political prisoners or just social prisoners, regular prisoners, are some of the most hardworking movement leaders for environmental justice, who are connecting the movements for civil rights, human rights, and prisoners' rights to the movement for environmental justice. And if we can take the 13th Amendment seriously, then we, I think, in my opinion, can reframe and recast the movement for environmental justice in prisons as also a form of a slave rebellion. And that's not just hyperbole coming from me. We can see this in movements like the Free Alabama movement. In the state of Alabama, imprisoned folks there are literally saying, we're going to go on strike because we refuse to do unpaid, coerced labor. We are being treated as slaves, and we want to push back against that. And so for me, that's really exciting, because that suggests quite clearly that this movement is building on the centuries-old movement for abolition. So I want to end with this guy, Bryant Arroyo, who's a lifer serving a life sentence at a prison in the great state of Pennsylvania. And just a few years back, he got wind that the town supervisors, that is the elected officials in the town in which his prison is located, had made a decision to bring in a $800 million coal gasification plant, right? Something that would clearly contribute greenhouse gases, but also produce particulate matter that would affect the humans in the town and the human beings who are incarcerated, including the corrections officers. So Mr. Arroyo said, you know what? That's a bad idea. Maybe we can do something about it. So he began to write letters. He began to organize his fellow prisoners and got the media involved and got 900 of his fellow prisoners to sign petitions and letters. And before brick number one was laid on the foundation, stopped this coal gasification plant from being built. This guy did this. He's a lifer. He's behind bars. He will most likely never see the light of day on the other side of the prison walls. So I just bring this example up to say that if this guy, Mr. Arroyo, could do that work, lifting himself and 800 to 900 of his fellow prisoners up in what I can only describe as an amazing victory for human rights, prisoner rights, and environmental justice for people inside and on the other side of the prison walls, maybe, just maybe you and I, those of us in the free world on the other side of those prison walls, if you think about it, we might be able to exercise and enjoy far greater power than we ever imagined before in the service of environmental and social and climate justice. So maybe we should think about that more deeply and more clearly. So I want to say thank you to all of you for putting up with me, for listening to me. I'm happy to take questions. And I also, of course, want to give a huge thanks to my amazing research assistants, without whom this project would not exist. So thanks so much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Pellow. This was really an inspiring and thought-provoking talk. I'll take the privilege of the first question, and then we'll turn it over to folks in the Q&A. So I was struck by the example you ended with, where there's a person with very little in terms of conventional sources of social power, able to achieve dramatic social change. And so often we see the reverse, where the people, where issues don't become a priority until people in power get involved in them. So can you talk a little bit about that? I know that the theory of critical environmental justice speaks directly to that, but how can we see that playing out, and what paths or avenues for positive change would you point to?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. It's such an important example and question. And I also want to acknowledge, some people might be thinking, well, are you romanticizing, what these imprisoned folks are doing? And I've mentioned Mr. Arroyo in a number of other talks, and one, sometimes people say, yeah, but what's he in prison for doing? For me, that's not entirely relevant. But the point that you're making, and I agree with, is that power is a curious thing, and there's no one formula for understanding how this thing flows. There's no formula for understanding, what the ingredients are that we need to make sure that any social change work or efforts that we're producing are going to result in positive outcomes. You just never know. But for me, it's inspiring and important, precisely for the reasons that you and I have both stated, that somebody with all of these indicators of powerlessness was able to really flex their muscles. And for me, a lesson there is that he didn't do it alone, that as much as we are in this Western European cultural tradition, and certainly I am, that says that, every individual matters and everyone counts and every individual can make a difference. I agree with that, but we can almost always make far more of a difference, exponentially more of a difference, if we are working collectively through organizations, through large numbers of people to make massive social change. And so for me, this is super inspiring because he really, really understood that. And it's also a story of the importance of allies. Don't be afraid to ask for help. And he couldn't have done this if he didn't have allies on the outside. Lawyers, family members, environmentalists, and prisoner rights activists who were pitching in to make this struggle more visible, and really saw it as a multi-scalar struggle, that this isn't just about one guy in one prison in Pennsylvania, that this was also about fighting climate change. So people from all over the world felt that they had a stake and some skin in the game for this struggle. So I think I've partially answered that question. Thanks.
No, that's great. Thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat box about the use of the term environmental. A couple different, I think takes on the same question, which is basically, we could imagine a talk like this where you organize it under the rubric of social justice. So what is gained by explaining all of these different areas of social injustice, also in terms of environmental justice?
Yeah, no, it's a really great point, because precisely because the definition of environmental justice, according to the scholarship and the movement, really does seek to be expansive and broad. And so one question that might come up that I'm hearing is, well, what are the limits there, right? How far does that go, and how useful is that? And for me, it's really a way of saying, yes, of course, this is about social justice, but that we can't fully, in my view, we can't actually fully understand social justice or racial justice or gender justice politics in the United States or anywhere in the globe without also understanding their connections to ecosystems, their connections to land and water. So the struggle for the civil rights movement, for example, was, also a struggle for food justice and economic justice, right? My mother was involved in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee's boycotts of restaurants in Nashville, Tennessee, that were not serving Black folks, right? That was a civil rights movement that was also a food justice movement. They wanted access to those foodstuffs. That, to me, is an environmental justice issue. For me, it also then allows us to, again, make that pivot and say, this isn't just about humans. This is also about more than humans, or not just humans, other animals out there. And so there's a lot of great work in political theory and the humanities, the environmental humanities, that's saying, you know what, we are multi-species communities. We are multi-species societies. We have always been and always will be. And even the human body is a multi-species phenomenon. 90% of our bodies are actually non-human. So that then opens up the possibility of really understanding, you know what, this isn't just about me. And even me is not just me, it's we. We are always a collective. And the final thing I'll say about that is that's super exciting, because then it gives us the opportunity to imagine governance and decision making and what our societies can look like in terms of the polity and policy if we're thinking about more than just humans. So for me, those are some of the opportunities that environmental justice theorizing opens up.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question is a very action-oriented question. How can people become more involved in the prison abolition movement? Where would you recommend people start?
Wow. Oh, where to start? There are so many wonderful organizations. My goodness. I mean, if you Google prison abolition, you'll come up with some great stuff. You know, out here in California, there's a group called Citizens United for a Responsible Budget, which, you know, sounds very anodyne, and they focus on a whole host of things, but they're involved in calculating the real cost of prisons in the state of California and have been very much supportive of abolitionist work. There, of course, is the group Critical Resistance, and they have a number of chapters. If there's not one in your neighborhood, you could start one. That would be amazing. There are a number of other organizations that are prison abolitionist groups that are started by students in universities. Some of which are connected to these groups called underground scholars. People are formerly incarcerated who are themselves students. So there are a host of a whole range of groups. And if you're interested in becoming a lawyer, or if you are a lawyer, there's a number of great groups. The Environmental Defense Legal Center, I think, is the group that's based up in Eugene, Oregon, run by, what's her name? Regan is her last name. And there's also a group in Pennsylvania called the Abolitionist Law Center. So there are actual practicing attorneys who see themselves as abolitionists who are doing this great work. So, and I don't want to be fundamentalist or sort of orthodox about it. There's plenty of holes and gaps and limitations to the idea of abolition. So I certainly welcome those critiques. And I think we should be very reflective and reflexive about that. But yeah, those are some thoughts.
That's great. And I think one last question that will tie very nicely to your last point, and then I would imagine that if folks have burning issues, they can reach out to you with the email address that you've posted on the last slide of your presentation. We had a couple of questions about reform. So balancing the abolition end goal with near-term reform efforts. How do you balance those two? And then what types of reform efforts could improve environmental justice situations on the ground in prisons in the near term?
Yeah, so I would say I'm one of these folks who believes that, you know, abolition is a wonderful, if not lofty goal. It's a laudable goal. But at the very moment, right, it's February of 2021, we have prisons, we have jails, we have detention centers. And we've got to work with the system that we have. That's my view. At this very moment, especially going back at least a few years and certainly last spring and summer with the movement for Black Lives, the rebellion and the unrest, not only in the United States, but globally around Black Lives Matter, we really saw some incredible victories that I could easily say are, you know, sort of skirting that boundary between reform and maybe transformation, with people being let out of carceral facilities because of COVID, right? Because it's totally impossible for social distancing or physical distancing to occur in carceral spaces around the United States and around the world. Prior to that, the good time bills at the federal level and various state levels that have been proposed and in some cases passed, where people are doing good time and, you know, behaving themselves and not getting violations on their record, are allowed to get out of prison early. So we're seeing this movement for decarceration that frankly abolitionists would have only dreamt about years ago. And then of course, decriminalization and even legalization of, say, cannabis, for example. We are seeing jails being shut down, detention centers being shut down in various parts of the country. So we are actually living in a time where abolition is actually being practiced. So the last part of your question, how could people's lives be improved in prisons? Well, they're doing it every day. I mean, the Free Alabama movement secured a number of victories around protection of people who were working in prisons. We've seen a number of victories as a result of hunger strikes, where the quality of food in prisons, such as it is, has been improved. And frankly, prisoners around the country and around the world are engaging in illegal resistance by getting cell phones through various channels, oftentimes through prison guards. And using cell phones, they've been able to document many of the hazards in prisons, send that to people on the outside, to the media, to lawyers, despite the fact that the way they were able to do that was breaking the law, because having a cell phone is against the law. That has led to improvements in people's well-being. Again, access to cleaner water, access to showers, shining a light on some of the brutality in the system. And frankly, on Eighth Amendment violations, cruel and unusual punishment, where we've seen a number of victories. And the Abolitionist Law Center in Pennsylvania has been behind some of those legal victories. So there are a number of things that we can do. Read up if you want to find more information. Prison Legal News is the #1 publication in the prison system in the United States. And they really do a really good job of reporting on kind of the latest struggles, legal and otherwise, in jails and detention centers and prisons, and a really, really good source of information on some of the positive things that are happening in these spaces.
Wonderful. Well, we are sadly out of time. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And I just encourage folks to take this call to action seriously and to see how everybody can be incorporating this movement towards environmental justice and social justice and prison reform and abolition into their work going forward. So you're hearing a round of applause from all these folks up in Washington State, but thank you so much, Dr. Pellow.
Thank you, Dr. Cordner. And can I say it is always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. You are a fantastic leader in our field. Thank you for your signature contributions to the work that we are doing as a collective. I have admired your work for many years and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Too kind.
Thanks so much.